Hello and welcome to the IEA's YouTube channel. I'm Len Shackleton, Editorial and Research Fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs. This afternoon I'm joined by political scientist Nick Cowen, who has written a chapter in our new IEA book, Having Your Say, Threats to Free Speech in the 21st Century. Now, Nick is a senior lecturer in criminology in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Lincoln. He's previously published a lot of research on John Stuart Mill's approach to freedom of speech, including a paper in the American Journal of Political Science. Now, Nick, welcome. How are you?
Oh, doing very well. Thanks for having me, Len.
Good. Now, your chapter, Nick, is titled Tolerating Extreme Speech. Now, that's pretty provocative stuff. I mean, most liberals will happily go along with free speech in general, but then they hedge that around with all sorts of qualifications about what you can and what you can't say. You're not doing that exactly. So, what is your position? Tell us about your thinking on this.
So I suppose my key observation is that it's very hard to kind of pin down what extremism means. It's one of those things that is kind of thrown out there and it's assumed to be a major threat to civil society in some way. But when you try and pin down what it might mean in practice, you find that it's very hard to identify a small number of extremists that are definitely away from the mainstream. So, for example, in a liberal democratic society, we might imagine that most people will agree that democracy is very important. So whatever else you might disagree on, you might say, well, we need democracy, the rule of law, and a few basic laws that everyone should agree to. And yet, when you look at surveys, you find that a remarkably large number of people, fortunately, normally still a minority, but still a fairly large, sizable minority, are actually quite cool on democracy itself. A lot of people think it's actually rather annoying dealing with democratic institutions, and actually can see the appeal of alternative regimes. So we can't criminalize all of them, or we can't sanction all of them. So instead, if you are going to target extremists, you normally try and find some other group or find some other definition. And there we just find it harder and harder to identify a specific way of picking them out. So, for example, we might say, well, people who advocate violence as a solution to political problems, they might be one viable target. And of course, if we're dealing with people who are planning violence, then obviously that is a legitimate thing for the criminal law to become involved. But merely maybe approving or condoning violence or saying that it's justified in principle, that has its problems too, because of course the state that we all use in order to cooperate uses violence a great deal. We use police, we use the army, and we use prisons in order to achieve social ends. And so an awful lot of people who are labeled extremists are really just contesting what those ends should be. In the UK, we normally tend to think of Islamists, so people who essentially believe that we should replace, this constitutional monarchy with a kind of Sharia-based regime. They would be an example. And then we have far-right extremists who believe in, say, the aggressive repatriation of racial minorities. And you might say, well, they appear to be advocating violence in order to achieve their political ends, but ultimately they are really just arguing that they want a different regime that uses violence in different ways from the way that we're using it right now.
I kind of always assume that people with these sort of extreme views were very much a minority, but you're suggesting, in fact, that more of us are extreme than we like to admit. Is that the case?
Yes. And on its face, that is a little bit of a worry. But it turns out that I suppose most people probably have some extreme in the sense of off-center views. In other words, views that are kind of held by only a small minority. And I think that classical liberals are more familiar with this kind of experience. So, for example, classical liberals among each other would probably say that, say, the decriminalization of all drugs and sex work. Among many classical liberals, open borders would be a kind of reasonable policy to discuss. Very, very much minority positions in a lot of mainstream politics. So I think we're kind of a little bit more aware of this, but a lot of people who say operate in the mainstream, perhaps around Westminster, might imagine that most of the country kind of agrees with them. What I'm saying is that when you actually ask people, especially in anonymous surveys, you find out that people actually have a lot of highly varied opinions, and ones that many would, probably without looking at these surveys, would identify as extreme or marginal.
I mean, obviously, I come at it from a different angle from you because I'm an economist, and I tend to look at kind of revealed preference rather than what people say they're going to do. Or, I can imagine that many people might, in the privacy of answering an online survey or something, might well take positions which look a bit off the map. But whether they would actually mean those, or they would be prepared to talk about those to anybody, I think it's slightly different, isn't it?
Yes, and I think that's the reason why we should be very hesitant to criminalize mere opinion, because that's ultimately what we tend to be talking about. Now, I would actually tend to agree with the economistic standpoint on this, that whatever people say in surveys, people's tend to prudently adhere to the rules that are given in a society. Most people are not interested in engaging in political violence, no matter what their opinions are. And they tend to worry essentially about whether the state is providing essential public services, whether they are allowed to, live by themselves or with their families, and whether they are able to engage with their local community in a kind of basic way, and whether they're allowed to, say, earn a living. So it's these kind of basic things that I think economists would tend to rank fairly highly in terms of people's revealed preferences, that actually explain why people tend to follow what the state's rules are, including a liberal democracy. What I'm saying is that actually relatively few people will be prepared to fight to maintain a liberal democracy. But once you've got a liberal democracy, it tends to be quite stable, so long as it's able to keep things like, the economy and public services running in a tolerable degree.
Now, I mean, one of the things I sort of feel about reading your stuff is this part of that this general discussion about, it depends how you frame it, people are being left behind, we need to level up. We have a kind of metropolitan, cosmopolitan elite who are not listening to what people are saying out in the sticks. I mean, is this part of the thing you're talking about here? Are extremists really people who are being ignored in a way by mainstream politics?
I suppose most people are ignored by mainstream politics normally. So, like politics, especially active political participation, is always a kind of minority pursuit. It's essentially an elite pursuit. So I think in terms of thinking about social cleavages, it's certainly the case that the way people express themselves is a way in which people mark themselves out as a member of the elite. And so to find the way that people outside that elite express themselves may be disgusting or kind of unpalatable is kind of part of how they express their social identity. But I would say that, part of my point is that actually extremism turns up in all kinds of places. So, although right-wing extremism is one that is kind of prominent in public policy, you could find quite a few, say, if you look at some protests that occasionally turn up on the left wing of the spectrum, you'll also find violent rhetoric being used and expressed there. And they're also contesting what is legitimate use of violence. So, eat the rich would be a form of rhetoric that, we don't take literally, but it nevertheless has quite a kind of violent kind of element to it. And the people who are expressing that, they're not necessarily left behind. They might be members or about to become members of the metropolitan elite themselves, but at that particular moment, they're using violent rhetoric to express the way that they believe. And all I'm saying is that enough people have that kind of feeling, that kind of intuitive feeling of wanting to express themselves in a visceral way, that it's best not to criminalize that kind of activity.
Now, in your chapter, you talk about, as an example, you talk about the English Defence League, right? And you say there, I find this quite interesting, that really a lot of the membership are really just guys looking for a rumble. They're looking for a fight somewhere. And there's a difference between the leadership, who actually has some kind of intellectual coherence behind it, but the bulk of the foot soldiers are people just looking for a bit of action, you know, kicking people in and that kind of stuff. Is that what you're saying? And is that, I mean, that clearly isn't confined to the right, is it? I mean, if you look at some of the Occupy demonstrations and things like this, Extinction Rebellion, all these kind of things, there's, there can often be quite a strong element of let's take on the police and so on, which you see on the right as well.
Yes. That's right. So this is sort of drawn from work by John Meadowcroft and Elizabeth Ralph Morrow, who are sort of based around King's College London. And they found that from doing sort of ethnographic field work that people who were involved in the English Defence League, tended to be of, I suppose, relatively low social capital, relatively low self-esteem, had a certain kind of taste for violence, a certain disagreeableness and kind of enjoyment of violence that I think is unlikely. I mean, that's kind of what makes them marginal, not their political beliefs. Most of their political beliefs, although obviously to the right, are not so different from a lot of people who are non-violent, who would vote for mainstream political parties but expect them to do something about immigration. That's the kind of way that so what really differentiated them was that they were initially recruited from places like kind of hooligan groups involved in football, and they might have found that it was difficult to arrange fights with rival football clubs because the police are kind of a lot more careful on doing that, and they found this was an alternative outlet for doing it. And so in that case, one way of thinking about like the protest associated with the EDL and counter-protesters, many of the counter-protesters may have had a similar interest in being able to identify an enemy engaged in a form of contained violence. Many of them were kind of almost producing a good for each other. They were kind of coming away feeling more united. They had a common enemy, and they got to enjoy a kind of a rumble that to some extent was overseen by police that may have stopped it from getting completely out of hand. And the problem is that it's got a political valence, and it's happening in the streets where a lot of people don't want to see that kind of activity. So it was kind of the protest itself and the kind of visceral experience of and potential and actuality of violence is what attracts a lot of shall we think of maybe the foot soldiers in these organizations. That's quite right.
Yeah. So this all paints extremism as being a kind of male thing, doesn't it? It's the boys want to get together in a gang and meet another gang and that kind of stuff. But what about female extremism? Have you any thoughts about this?
Well, all I can say is that, from the existing evidence, it seems that, most people interested in that kind of street level violence tend to be men. And indeed, most of the, shall we say, intellectual cadre tend to be men as well. Although I would imagine that you might find, women more involved at that level than, rather more likely that perhaps than engaging in direct action. I certainly wouldn't say it's exclusively men. If you look at, I suppose, other kind of forms of protest, other direct action groups, then you will find that women can be involved. All I'd say is that, on average, for a number of reasons, not all of which we fully understand, men on average tend to be more disagreeable as a personality trait than women. And I suppose if you're looking, we're looking towards the end of the bell curve here. So we're looking towards people who are particularly disagreeable. Then I suppose what you're going to find is more and more emphasis on men being involved and relatively fewer women. But I wouldn't want to, exclude women as being within this model. It just tends to be more men on the on that end who are interested in violence, not necessarily people who adhere to particular political views. I think that if you look at marginal political views, I think you'll find plenty of women involved in developing those ideas.
Mm-hmm. So you don't think then intellectually that there's a kind of gender extremism gap? You think that intellectually there are a lot of women who would actually endorse some extreme positions? I mean, I think particularly of some of the supporters who emerged from the Islamic groups and so on, the girls who went over to to fight. Any thoughts on that type of behaviour?
Well, I think in that instance, you know, I mean, the Islamic State, you know, it wasn't just about fighting. They were trying, they were sort of founding a you know, a new regime, one that actually had a very specific place for women, a subordinate place for women, but one, you know, that might be attractive to certain personality types. So it's attracting certain kinds of male personality types, and it turns out it also attracts some female personality types. And I'm sure that the women who were involved would have had the same kind of, I suppose, intellectual complexity that you would find in people who would actually, you know, make a move from, you know, from their country of birth to another country. I mean, they're basically what was attempting to be a new country. So there, I think we're dealing with people who are genuinely marginal. So you know, we're dealing with people with an intellectual you know, commitment to a new ideology, and you know, that might well be something that you can kind of separate out, you know, because they were engaged very deliberately in violence. You know, they made plans, and they made, you know, they kind of made commitments to it, and that's where we're moving away from tolerating extreme speech towards looking at actual plans for violence, where, you know, where the criminal law is legitimate for coming in.
Mm-hmm. A little earlier on, you were speaking about recruiting, the English Defence League recruiting, you know, from football hooligans and so on. So what do you make of the kerfuffle the other night with about racist tweets to the English team, or, you know, when the three players of colour missed the penalties at the end? What do you think about that? What does that tell us about what's going on in England?
Well, I suppose it's hard to know exactly what it means, because, of course, Twitter is an international platform, and tweets are coming in from everywhere. And you know, as you know, currently they are, you know, anonymous, so we don't really know how many of them came from Brits. So we wouldn't want to, like, make a particular assumption about what it is that Brits are doing. Having said that, I mean, I don't think it's nice for anyone to receive, you know, kind of harassment or malicious communications. Generally, I think that the platforms themselves, such as Twitter, are in a better position to handle that kind of malice than, say, the criminal law, because ultimately they control what happens on the platform. There, I think that Twitter is in a little bit of a bind, because I think that to some extent, rather like the individuals who enjoy, you know, violence in the street, so the protesters and counter-protesters that come together when the EDL was active, quite a lot of people enjoy kind of aggravation and pile-ons in Twitter. I think it drives actually a lot of engagement, people retweeting each other and kind of screenshotting their opponents and kind of saying, oh, look how awful it is. And Twitter is in a bit of a bind there, because, of course, that engagement also leads to more advertising revenue. So on the one hand, they don't want to become known for being a place where antisocial behavior can happen on the internet. On the other, it often seems to actually help their bottom line, at least in the short run. It can't help it in the long run if it gets too nasty for most people to be engaged in it. That's a problem that I think Twitter kind of fundamentally needs to sort out. I don't approve of every policy they have. I think they could police what they're doing a lot better, but I don't believe it's a very helpful priority for the government to be involved. And I mean, one thing that occurs to me is that I think what is very shocking about footballers receiving such malicious communications is that in many respects they are very much a kind of a member of the elite. They're very high status people. They're amazing athletes. They're very attractive people. They earn a fantastic living. And I think one feature of social processes we notice is that when elite actors are threatened, even in a fairly remote way, as happens over the internet, we find that very naturally shocking. Whereas the knowledge that, say, people living in poorer areas, vulnerable people, might be walking the street and kind of being subject to harassment. It might be because that they're women and they feel vulnerable to harassment from men, or because they're just vulnerable men who are just relatively low status, or because they're members of ethnic minorities and may receive racial epithets, similar racial epithets, but they're kind of issued in person. We're aware that that happens, and yet we don't get the same kind of moral kind of we don't get sort of angered and kind of shocked by it in the same way as when we hear that footballers are. So if I'm looking at where police resources should be focused, that is kind of the area where I wish we would kind of make our focus, because ultimately I believe that the relatively well off are quite well positioned to secure themselves from genuine threats in a way that relatively poor people are not necessarily in such a good way to secure themselves.
Yeah. So you don't think much of the Prime Minister demanding that the social media companies disgorge the identities of troublemakers? You think that's the wrong way to go?
I think it's something that is probably best left to Twitter to decide how to handle things. And I think although if people are making threats over Twitter, then that's a criminal legal matter again. But generally speaking, I think that the government is responsible for what happens on public roads, on public streets, and in our town centres. That's the area where the government claims to have a particular influence and control and responsibility. And I think that is where if you're trying to reduce the actual experience of harassment, including racial and gendered harassment, that's kind of where the government should be focusing its resources and not kind of tarrying quite so much with what's going on the internet.
I mean, one of the topics which recurs in several of the chapters in this book is the idea of hate crime. I mean, as a political scientist, what's your take on the idea of hate crime? I mean, we're told, I don't know how authoritatively, that something in excess of 100,000 a year reports of alleged hate crime. Does this really mean that the country is full of hateful people who spend their lives making it bad for the rest of us? Or what do you think these figures actually mean as a social scientist?
Well, I think the experience of hate is so I think one thing is hate is a kind of very human emotion. It's the other side of love and liking. So you can't criminalize hate itself. Normally when we think about hate crime, we think about particular vulnerable groups that are being targeted. And I think that whether kind of the experience being hated is a harm, something that causes harm, it depends very much on the context. So if you are a relatively high status actor, and you kind of you understand that people don't like you for some reason, then normally you can draw on social resources for that not to really make a big difference. But if you're if you're poor and vulnerable and you're subject to hate and hate and harassment, and you feel threatened by it, then it could be extremely life limiting. Now, as it happens, I don't think that the lenses of race, gender, and specific groups are particularly helpful for analyzing that kind of activity. So I think that we need strong rules on harassment, but I don't think that deciding to make certain forms of harassment better or more serious or less serious based precisely on the characteristics that are being targeted is particularly helpful. I think it's more important for authorities to focus on things like credible threats and forms of harassment that are essentially kind of coercive and changing people's basically altering the lifestyle and that people feel that they can have.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of blurring of the distinction between real life and what's on screen, possibly as a result of the fact we've been locked up for so long, and not meeting people and so on. I just wonder whether the nature of offence is whether the same rules should apply really to about harassment. I mean, harassment, if I'm in the office and somebody harasses me at my place of work, or in the street, or on a tube train, or whatever it may be, that's one thing. But writing nasty things on Twitter at 3 in the morning when you've had too much to drink, I just wonder whether that is quite as serious an issue. But you know, it may be that we should think about the subjective impact of this, I guess. What do you think?
I mean, it depends on the context. So kind of hate sort of projected at no one in particular out on the internet is you know, it's bad practice. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. And I wouldn't recommend, you know, tweeting while drunk or anything like that. But I think that its harm is quite limited, and ultimately it's just a form of expression which you know, is quite common. So, you know, what we're saying is that people in the privacy of their own minds and among friends are probably going to have some rather unpalatable opinions. That's what you find in the you know, in the literature, that people do have malicious thoughts, and there's what we want is rules that structure it so that people don't have to worry about other people's malicious thoughts so much. Whereas you know, obviously you can see, you know, people do use Twitter to issue threats to people. So rival gangs do that sometimes, Twitter and other platforms. They might you know, issue threats to minorities, sex and gender minorities, for example. And there, I think it is, you know, it is something that that needs to be that is something that is a legitimate subject for criminal law, something the police could be involved in. Although it's something that ideally I would hope that platform owners would kind of take the lead on stopping and sanctioning, essentially.
How do you feel on the line of forcing people to be identified on Twitter? I mean, it's always struck me as strange that, you know, if I want to write a letter to the Southend Echo complaining about the local headmaster or something, I have to give my name and address, and that, of course, has a moderating effect on what I say. Whereas, you know, the whole thing about Twitter and similar social media is that there is this anonymity. Now, I can see in certain circumstances, anonymity is important. But I mean, newspapers have always had this thing, you know, where you can, you know, name and address supplied or something like that if you're making a particularly dangerous point which might affect your work or whatever it may be. Why have we got into this position with social media where you can pretend to be somebody else and, you know?
Well, I think pretending to be someone else, particularly someone else who's real, that's something that you definitely want to discourage. So, you know, because you could you could deliberately libel someone by misrepresenting who you are. But anonymity or pseudonymity, that has always played a very great role in political discussion. You know, so if you think about the you know, the Federalist Papers, you know, so important people who you know, tried to develop a new regime, the United States in that instance, couldn't really get it off the ground unless they were able to publish under various names. So I think that there is a role for that, not necessarily for writing to your local newspaper. I leave it up to newspapers to decide what information you need to give in order to get your in order to be published there. And so ultimately, I think it's up to Twitter to make that kind of determination. I have done some research with sex and gender minorities recently, and this did come up as one possible solution for reducing the amount of hateful communications over those platforms. But these individuals that I spoke to also said that it was actually quite important for many of their activities that they were able to be anonymous. So if someone's coming from a familial group, or, you know, a group in society that, say, for example, does not appreciate LGBT identities, then at least for a time, or potentially for a long time, they might benefit from being able to express themselves anonymously and be able to find, you know, a community, you know, their own community online without having the risk of being exposed. So there's a lot of legitimate reasons why you would want to be anonymous online. My preferred solution would actually be to give Twitter users a lot more control over who is allowed to reply to them. Twitter is kind of moving a bit in that direction. Who is able to read their tweets, and what kind of responses, and kind of what kind of actions are permissible, and also what kind of content you want to see. So you should have a lot more control over what content you're going to be exposed to when you come onto Twitter, and how much content you disclose to other people. So, for example, I wouldn't be opposed to Twitter offering a kind of verified system for people who want to be so. So, if you have your Twitter account, you prove who you are, and then people could say, oh, I only want to speak to people who are willing to state their full name and have proven their full name to the satisfaction of Twitter. So then you'd have a very different conversation. You'd only be talking to people that way. And I don't want to hear from anything from any anonymous accounts at all. So I think that would be one way of filtering and controlling the conversation. And I think what would be good about that is that rather than involving a kind of a brute force approach of going like, no, this is the rules of the way the internet works, rather it allows people to build up their own communities based on the rules that they find, kind of work for them. So that would be my preferred approach.
That's very interesting. I particularly like your reference really to the way in which this happened in the past, that people, would write under pro bono publico or something, some handle like that. Yeah, interesting point. Right. Well, can we just finish by asking you what you would like to see the government do, if anything, about these issues? What would you like to see some laws repealed? Would you like some new laws introduced? What's your position on this?
Let's see. What I think, generally speaking, the government that does least in these matters is probably the I'm always very hesitant to think that the government can really improve on a situation. As I've said, I think this is, the laws to tackle the harms that do exist already exist. Sometimes the resources don't exist, or the correct allocation does not exist. So I think a focus on people who are particularly vulnerable to harassment, I think it's still, people who find it hard to make their way around the real world. So, the spaces that people need to use is still the place where the government is best, is best fit to kind of try and tackle, that kind of violence and that kind of harassment. And that's where I'd like to see their focus. I suppose in the long run, I do see a greater role for common platforms. So I think perhaps like non-profit, in fact, I've written a little bit about the possibilities of blockchain as a kind of new institutional mechanism for allowing people to communicate over the internet without relying on these highly centralized platforms that in one sense tend to be very highly governed, because all the data is kind of collected in one place, in kind of Silicon Valley and controlled there. And on the other hand, because it's quite expensive, is actually quite chaotic. So in other words, a lot of material gets out and it sometimes gets algorithmically highlighted and even increased because it's making money for those organizations at that particular moment. It turns out that private enterprises are not always the best at running what we might think of as two-sided markets, or kind of markets where they are basically the intermediaries for content being shared. So I'm quite hopeful that that we might see some technical solutions, some technical institutional innovations that are going to make living online actually a lot more convenient and good. And for that, I really think that apart from just allowing that to happen and not kind of trying to sort of keep the current system in place, in other words, not protecting the existing platforms from competition, I think that's the best that the government can do for the time being.
Well, thank you, Nick. That's been a fascinating discussion, and thank you, viewers, for watching this. If you'd like to directly support the IEA's digital output, you can sign up to become an IEA patron. You'll get early access to our videos, bespoke IEA perks, and other exclusive benefits. So head over to patreon.com/IEA London, or follow the link in the description box to find out more.